Let's pray. Holy God, as we end this time looking at love without limits, would you remind us of how your love is limitless and calls us to always push the boundaries of where we feel comfortable and where we are willing to express your grace and your compassion for this world. God, would you bless our study of this book this morning? Amen. Amen. So we come to the end. Today we're doing chapters 7, 9, and 10 of Love Without Limits. And if you're just joining us for the first time this week, this is a book we've been reading by a professor who writes about her experience challenging her idea of love and her idea of who and how we're supposed to love. So she's writing about whether love has boundaries and how Jesus' love has boundaries or has no boundaries. So we're starting off today in chapter 7, which is a chapter about her moving to Fargo. And just to quickly summarize what happens in this chapter. She lives in Florida. She's born and raised in Florida, the Sunshine State, the place where it's warm all the time. And she gets a job offering, as many professors do, that's not in a place where she particularly wants to live. So she has to move to Fargo, North Dakota, where she says the temperature ranges from -50 in the winter to over 100 degrees in the summer. And she is really challenged out here. She says she feels like she doesn't want to go there, but she feels called to go there. And so a lot of the chapter is her wrestling with this idea of her call. And is her call really enough to make her love this strange, uncomfortable place that she's living in? So the first question really hits her beginning, her kind of initial feelings about Fargo. Are there any places where you've lived where you really had a strong bias against it? Because initially she had a really strong bias against Fargo. She says it's cold, it's desolate, right? She doesn't necessarily like the people out there. Why does she have to live in this awful, this awful hellscape, Fargo?
When I went away to college, my parents moved from the town that I grew up in, Floral Park, all my life. I went to college and I came back for Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving wasn't in Long Island. My parents had moved to Massachusetts. So no matter what happened, I didn't want to go to Massachusetts to go home for Thanksgiving. It wasn't home. I didn't know anybody there. And it was kind of a dislocation. I didn't see my friends and other ones. And this is a place that I predetermined I'm not going to like, which is true to this day, but it was an interesting experience.
When we first moved into Garden City, Manny and our children wanted us to come to Garden City Community Church. But because we were attending a Presbyterian church before, I said, no, I want to go to the Presbyterian church. Family wanted here. So I said, okay, we'll go. But I'm not going to do anything. I'll just sit on, wherever I was. We used to sit in the balcony. And I was like so smug, sitting there, just looking. And then a few weeks after that, there was an announcement. They're looking for somebody to work with the Christian education. So it went on for several weeks. I still need someone to go. And I said, I am in Christian ed, so why not just join this group? And I volunteered. Up to now, I'm here. So it's a place where I didn't want to be, but I ended up in a place where I love to be.
Definitely. So Mary, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you've lived all over the world.
Yeah, but I've never had that feeling. If I was going someplace, I was interested in getting there, and then I didn't know what I was getting into. It might be very different from anything I'd known before, but I went there because I wanted to do the job that was to be done, so it didn't matter to me that it was a stranger place. I don't go with her and all this stuff.
Yeah, I get the feeling that Jacqueline Bussey is a little bit of a homebody, maybe. But some of us are definitely more adventurous and have a sense of want to see what's out there.
Well, she wanted to teach, and she got there, and she didn't want to go to the place. I don't have any patience with that. So
Yeah, I hear you.
I think she's a person with a lot of personal problems, a lot of hate that brings her to this, write this book about the need for love.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Maybe one of the reasons why she feels compelled to love without limits is because she feels challenged in that area. That's as good a reason as any to write a book about love. So I have to say, about a year ago, I had to swallow my humble pie and admit to Serena that New Jersey was a better place to live than New York. And that was hard. That was hard. And I realize I'm in the wrong state to say that right now. I should be in New Jersey when I'm saying that, but you know, you do have to be open to new experiences. Otherwise, you're going to sit there in Fargo and be miserable because it's cold out. Well, that's what Fargo does. So, and that's kind of the point she gets to, right? Is she starts saying, like, you have to learn to appreciate. I'm not going to get too far in because that's a later question. But she says you got to kind of learn to appreciate the place that you're at and what's there. Because if you don't, you're going to spend your whole time regretting what you don't have and not appreciate what's wonderful about what you do.
well, it's interesting thing about Fargo. I was there because I was doing the circuit as a missionary, and I was there for a couple of days and put up in somebody's house. There's a railroad line that goes right through the center of town. And when the train comes at night, it's over 100 cars long, and it stops at the station. And if you're waiting at a crossing, you can wait half to 3/4 of an hour before you can have a chance to cross. So you have to know when the trains are coming, and if you want to get across to the other side for a store or something, you got to do it. And know that you can't come back because that train sits there half the night.
Oh my goodness.
Midnight at night. But I found it was sort of fun to see a long train because I don't see them here.
Yeah, it just keeps.
And I didn't have to cross.
We
So
crossed in 2 stations on Long Island, right? It was so long.
I could look out the window and see the long train. They're over 100 cars long. Freight trains.
Did you count them?
So,
I thought it was interesting that her husband said something along the line, the weather's never too cold, you're wearing the wrong clothes. He just adapted right away.
When I went away to college in my 50s, which was a whole other subject, but I became involved in the Wellesley Residence Life program because they find that, like for instance, on a certain week, like by 5th week, people are starting to get really homesick. So they had Flower Sunday, and your big sister would bring you, go with you to the service and bring you flowers and whatever like that. But they had T-shirts that said, Wellesley Res Life, bloom where you're planted. Now you've got to figure, these young women are in a tiny room sharing. They may never shared before. It has to be a jolt to the system. I was in a program where we each had our own room, we shared everything else, but so it was interesting to work on that angle and try to work toward having activities so everybody was happy with their living circumstances. But people came from all over the world, not just from within our country, of course. So it was fascinating to see the glimpse of people who really started to get homesick. I was just like, oh, I have to enjoy every minute of this, whereas they were like, and the pressure of the studies as well. So it was interesting.
So the next question is related. Think about the place where you live now or a place where you have lived. What did it teach you? What did you learn from living somewhere that was very different from a place where you grew up?
I'll go first. I was born in Boston. My parents were both going to school there. But when I was 4, they decided to move us to Puerto Rico and raise us there, which is kind of backwards from everybody else. So I was upset because I didn't want to leave Boston. I was always resenting the island. But in hindsight, it taught me the value of family. I grew up with a huge family. And what is really important is really just that. So it took me a long time to appreciate it. When I left, that's when I missed it. That's when I said, oh, now I get it, now I understand. But it taught me what's really important. We were unplugged from electronics. We lived up in the mountains. It was beautiful. So they teach me to love nature and to appreciate family and to respect my elders, because now, I don't know, the way my children were raised here is very different. So they're kind of selfish. So because I had to grow up with taking care of my grandma, my grandpa, my great-grandma, I have a different set of values. They're very much self-centered growing up here because they didn't have any close family.
Interesting. Now, I'm curious, how much do you feel that was the lifestyle that you lived there, and how much do you feel it was the culture of Puerto Rico, which is also very family-centric?
It's a mixture of both, right? Like my parents are very traditional, so it's very different, very different. And then when I moved back here, felt like a fish out of water again, because this is where I wanted to be, but then I missed the craziness of a big family. But it did teach me a lot. And anyone who's grown up in the country can adapt to anything. Like if you've grown up in a very rural area, you can adapt to anything. Whereas I think if you go backwards, it's a little harder. So adapting is pretty easy once you come from that kind of area.
Talk it into it. Get to me.
What else?
I was brought up in Flushing, Queens, in a lily white area, lily white school. When I was 21, everything was white, I lived in a fairy tale land. I married my husband, and a week later, he was stationed in Louisiana. And there I was, in a place that was eye-opening, to see people living in homes without windows, without doors. It was all right to run over a black person, but not a white person. I mean, it was so far down in the South. It was incredible. I never knew what prejudice was until I went down there. It's really quite interesting.
And mine fits in with that because my first assignment after I left here was in a village in the interior of China. No electricity, no water, no cars, very rural, very dusty. I had been brought up in suburbs of New York City on the New Jersey side. So to adjust to having to go get water every day from a well, of having to light lanterns every night, and they keep the lanterns trimmed if you wanted to have a light. And you had a whole room just for the lanterns so that you could put the kerosene in and keep them going. It was a whole different life.
Wow.
And you had to have a donkey and a cart if you wanted to go any place.
That's wild.
I've had the opposite experience because except for some of my married life where we had bought a house out in Plainview, I lived in the house I grew up in. And I've seen so much change. I mean, it's incredible. But very interesting. I'm probably the only owner of the block. I am, who has owned the house from the beginning. And it's very interesting, and even though I don't get to move around, people are always moving in and out of houses, and there are new people to make relationships with.
So you learn a lot by just staying put.
What comes to my mind is in El Salvador, where I had a boyfriend who was born in a hut, and his life was so interesting because ultimately he became the head tennis pro of a man who was a billionaire. And he was a ball boy in El Salvador, and one day somebody said to him, it was a New York lawyer who said, Raphael, would you like to learn English? So that man brought him to New York. His English is very good, and played tennis, and then here was this man who was a billionaire who owned a tennis court at a certain day and time, and so from there, Raphael got to have a house in Bermuda, travel all over the world. But I remember what he said once, I could go back to El Salvador, kind of like your thought, I could go back and live there. And when I was there at Christmas time, the time, it was so interesting. One day was sort of like 5 days of our days put together, and everything was so slow, and I just loved it. The mother would carry the corn on top of her head, and she'd go down to have it mashed into, corn for tamales. We made tamales, and then this little chicken I had gotten friends with, and all of a sudden we're eating the chicken. So, but it was just wonderful. I've always loved variety and different people and different customs, and I just find it fascinating. But somehow he with this discussion we're having popped into my head of the contrast that he said he could go back there and live. And, nice memories.
So I went to college with a girl from Vermont, and after college she's from like rural, maybe half an hour from Burlington, but like there's cows, you look at her window, there's cows, there's mountains, it's absolutely gorgeous, but she loves that, like she grew up riding horses, but she was actually born in Long Island City. And she was the kind of person who was never meant to be in Long Island City. She was supposed to be in Vermont. But she graduated, and her parents really wanted her to go to grad school. And so the two of us moved in together in New York City. And I was so happy because I had someone to live with, so I could afford to have an apartment. And I had always wanted to live in New York City because I've been going there since I was little. Like Mary, I grew up actually maybe 10 minutes from where Mary grew up in New Jersey. And so I was thrilled. It's like, there's people everywhere, it's really busy. And she was just like, I hate this. They touch me, they're too close. I have so much anxiety. And her now husband, missed her, and so he found a job in the city, and so before they got married, they were living together in Brooklyn, and I always knew they would leave because they both hated it so much. It's like what you were saying about how it's easier to go from rural to the city. He's just like, I can't do it. There's too many people. I need to go back where there's fields and quiet and silence. And the only sound you open your window is, the cows from like a farm 2 farms down. But how they knew for a while that the place they needed to be was New York City because of the jobs that they had and what they were learning there, and even though it wasn't a place they would have naturally picked. But it also allowed us to have 3 more years of being together, where now she's far away. So it's interesting how where you end up or where you need to be. And
I could also say something about a job placement. It doesn't necessarily have to be a different state.
Yeah, right. It could just be different circumstances.
Right. I'm a business undergrad, but then I stayed home for a lot of years with my children. So when I went back to school, I got my master's in education. But I fell in love with Montessori, and that's what I wanted to do. But I was advised not to pursue that because there might not be enough jobs, and just get your regular master's. And I despise public school systems so much. But I have to do it because the bills have to be paid. But it has taught me a lot of what I don't want. So now I'm pursuing, again, my passion, which is Montessori, and to travel the world, because with that kind of license, you can travel the world as a teacher. So it could, it could go both ways. You don't have to move from a state, but it definitely a job can open your eyes to what you do or do not want.
My family moved from Astoria to Brooklyn, and on the day of my birthday, they said, well, why don't you go to Eppett's Field? So I did. I walked up, and some big young men came behind me, and they said, hey, kid, come on in with us. And that was right behind the Brooklyn Dodger dugout. And anything, Frankfurter soda, whatever it was, and they even won the game. And that was before they moved to Los Angeles.
Well, I grew up in Syosset, which was, as Alice says, like it's an old white area. And my mom says, never, go to Westboro because it's a black area. And we lived there for now 35 years. So it's a nice integrated area in Westbury, not too far from the Holyrood Cemetery off Old Country Road. And families, really nice people. And so we had no problem living there.
Is your last name? Alice?
One more thing, that as I was growing up, I noticed something, and that was that at one point we had 3 Greek families that moved into the block. And I knew all of them, close to all of them. And another time, we had 3 Jewish families. It was as if one person moved in, then a couple of others did. And then Italians. And I remember some of the remarks, the uncomfortably censoring remarks of these groups, not from my family, but from other people, and how they treated each other. A Catholic family that accused my good friend of killing Jesus, and
So that's interesting, because in that case, the new situation is coming to you.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Very interesting. I just want to see how many hours we are at about the end of the time for chapter 7, but there's a few more I want to get to. Let's do this one and the next one. So these were 2 statements that she made that I thought were really good, and I wanted to spend some time with them. She says, comparison is the thief of joy. And then later she says that Facebook should really be called fake book. And I wanted to see what you guys thought about that when you read it. Is that something that resonates with you? How can you relate to it?
I went on to Facebook relatively late, and I think I always thought, at least a little I knew about it at the beginning, what it was like looking at everyone's Christmas letter every single day about how their life was perfect and wonderful, and there was not a lot of like true grit of feelings involved here. It was all, look at this new picture of my dad. And so, meanwhile, now I can't get off the animal videos, so I don't go there either. I could spend the whole afternoon being totally entertained. But I did think that was my moment against it, was thinking that it was just a little too good to be true. And on a daily basis, how could we take this? You know?
There's such pressure on teenagers too.
And teenagers.
My children are 20, 19, and 18. And sometimes I tell them, just turn it off. Just focus on you. You don't have to compete with anyone. No, we don't have a boat, but we have a car. And you have a roof over your head. So no, we don't have a Mercedes, but we have a nice Altima Relax. It's hard. And it's the pressure on all the social media outlets is so much on them. One little word, and I think it's making kids weak. Because any little comment, they get so offended, and some of them even commit suicide over. So it's. I like to see like the pretty traveling posts, but then everything else, it's so much.
Yeah, it's very selective what goes on and what doesn't go on, right? And then, as she kind of points to here, you end up getting so caught up in what you don't have that you're unable to enjoy what you do.
Plus, I think Facebook is like a photo album, it's the best parts of your
Right.
life. It doesn't reflect reality. If you look at a photo album, you understand that you're just looking at what people want to put in there. You're not going to put the tragedy in there. So Facebook is like that. You can't forget that that's what you're looking at, the best parts.
And in light of that, I was having a conversation with my students the other week about the different reasons people cry. Because someone had called another child a crybaby. It's okay to cry. Like, I cry, for lots of reasons. Like, you cry, show me a picture. I want to see a picture of you crying. I'm like, I don't have a picture of you crying. But the fact that they're like, well, I want documentation of it. Well, we don't document those moments. Like, if someone pulled out a camera while I was sobbing and took my picture, I'd probably want to punch them in the face. It's like, that's not helpful right now. But it is, and I'm on Instagram a lot, and as a teacher, there's a lot of great things, but I always appreciate it when someone, after this perfect classroom photo, puts, my room does not always look like this. These are my best moments. This is when I'm having a good day. This is not every moment. I get frustrated, I yell, I don't make the right choices, because it's like this picture, it's like, how is everything color coordinated? How have you had the energy to tidy after wrangling children? Like, that's not real, is it? But we don't put that online.
I will,
Go, Debbie.
Oh, I feel that I'm in touch with a lot of high school friends. Started out with one, and then we, got in touch with each other, and I started thinking, man, I'm aging. I look a lot older than they do. And then I realized there's just one guy who has a close-up photograph. and my pictures on there are pretty close up. But they were at parties, they had nice lighting, so I don't look that bad. But I realized I don't know what those people really look like up close anymore. And I know exactly how old they are, because I went to high school with them. So.
I used to work at Winthrop Hospital for 17 years, and this was when, I started in 1984. And if I go back now, which I often had to do with my mom and everything, I would see people who walk by and I would say, they look older. And I really I did, but they must be thinking the same thing. Like, they almost recognize me, and then they do recognize me, and it's because I must look, my age. But it happens, and but that's where I notice it the most, because that's where my old group of friend faces are, you know what I mean? So that happened in years.
oh, no, I was just gonna say, quite honestly, I don't see how people have time to do Facebook. I have 120 students that I work with, and just to take care of everything is just, I don't have time to check in, and I think, I managed to get in touch with people, but not enough because I'm still working, but I just think I would open I don't know, I've never been on Facebook, and I just don't have, time to sort of go in there and see what they're doing and they're doing and they're doing. I've got to take care of what I'm doing, something like that.
So true.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, it's like sand. It kind of fills the gaps that you have in time. And I think it states that curiosity that people have to say, like, what's going on in so-and-so's life? Like we all kind of have that, ooh, what's going on over there kind of urge to see, and this gives us, an avenue into that. But often it's not like the juicy, gossip-worthy stuff that we want. It's not that we should want, but that we kind of naturally want. It's sort of what people put forward as, sort of set up a tableau of this is the best, that I can show for myself. No?
Yesterday we had Nancy Witter for the women's event, and she spoke about Facebook also. She mentioned that it's, what we show on Facebook is not what's going on with us. It's not like when the roast that we are going to serve burned, it became so tough you could not serve it. And then, she told the story, for those who weren't here, she told the story about the monkey who ruined the dinner. So when I like using Facebook, but I always tell everybody, be very selective, be very careful, and also don't let it affect you, because some of the stories are not reality. I'll check out and look at me. I am in this restaurant, and doublets of drinks and everything. Or else they showed, I don't know why people would take a picture of their feet. I am in, I don't know what beach, and I keep saying, who cares? I just skip it, But there's a lot of information there that I look for. Garden City has a Facebook wall. Most of our leaders will put up pictures. Then what I do is I share the pictures on my wall. because it speaks something of a reality. There are issues that is going on that I am so passionate, I will put it up there. But I will never take a picture of my feet.
You and me both know. No one wants to look at my feet anyway.
One more thing, a warning. I just had my computer hacked very severely. And I am almost, I'm 99% positive that it was, you know, people post the little videos all the time. And a video came up that wasn't from anybody, and I wasn't looking carefully, and I opened it up, and then bada boom, you know, bada boom, bang, bang. My computer just, the whole screen went thing, and I had to call a computer guy, and it was just loaded with garbage, and they wanted me to pay money to get it fixed. It was a whole scam.
Yeah, they call that ransomware, because it takes your computer hostage and makes you pay ransom.
Oh.
Yeah, and I said,
In Bitcoin, right?
yeah, I said, I don't think so, but I really did. I didn't want to call the number, but I thought, well, I'll just be really careful. But they just led me through this long process and pretended like they were fixing my phone, you know, just to get to the point eventually where we need some specialists. Then $199.99. So I would be very careful about opening up any video that isn't from somebody you know.
Or anything at all. Don't click on any links, don't download any attachments, don't even open them if you don't recognize who it's from.
The same thing goes with if you get a phone call.
Yeah.
And hi, this is your grandson.
Yeah.
And I got one a couple of years ago, and I got in there for a while, and then I realized, and then I just hung up. But just about 3 days ago, I got one. And the minute I said, oh, I've got a lot of grandsons, I don't recognize your voice, and I hung up. But they'll put you in.
Yeah.
My telephone has always a caller IDs. If I do not recognize the ID or it doesn't have the name of the people at my book, I don't bother to answer. Because the first line they will say, oh, hey, how are you? And instinct you say, oh, I'm okay. And being careful for the telephone calls, never answer yes in any of their questions. Because they can take that, put it out into something, and then use your voice.
Okay, so Mary has the last word, and then we gotta move on from this.
Well, my last word is just that I think that she was using a euphemism. Comparison is the thief of joy. That's really jealousy, keeping up with the Joneses.
Yeah, there you go. Right, it is really about jealousy. Good observation. So we're not going to discuss this question because we're pretty much at the end of time for chapter 7, but I want to share this quote because I think this really sums up her conclusion. And she says, "It's my calling that keeps me warm." And what she meant by that is, yes, she was physically very cold in Fargo, right? And that being cold, that not being in Florida, the Sunshine State, was what made her so anxious about being there. But what she found is that living into her calling to be a professor there was what made it all worth the while. And her point in this is that when we orient ourselves towards calling, that helps us love something that we might have a strong bias against, or that we might not be otherwise willing to open ourselves up to. So chapter 9 was about grief. And this one was, she was talking about losing her mother to Alzheimer's, and how much pushback she found when she tried to find help for this grief. I mean, she talks about going to a counselor, and the first thing the counselor says to her is, despair is a sin against God, because we should never be hopeless when we have God. And she said that just shut her down from encountering this grief and talking to other people about it, because she felt like any time that she engaged it, it was a sin, and why would you feed into that? So there's a passage that the counselor reads that I think the meaning of that passage changes as we go through the chapter. And that passage is, "We do not want you to be uninformed," this is the Apostle Paul speaking, We do not want you to be uninformed about those who have died, so that we may not grieve as those who do not have hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have died. And the part of this she really focuses on is, do not grieve as those who have no hope. And so the place the counselor starts off at is, well, that means that you shouldn't feel hopeless and you shouldn't feel despair and you shouldn't let yourself feel those feelings because that's wrong and now God is going to judge you. So it's like, great, now I feel awful because I just lost my mother, and on top of that I feel like I'm failing God. How can this day get any better? And so she forms this idea that in the church we're very anti-grief and we're very anti-sadness. We kind of have a problem with that. So the first question just to open up with is, where have you experienced grief? And how did you cope with that? Are there places where you did feel like you were safe to experience that?
My father died when I was 17. I just graduated from high school. He was in a coma for 2 months after brain surgery, and we went often, and I was able to drive, so I was able to go often and try to wake him up from the coma. He was in Mercy Hospital. And when it was interesting, they couldn't wake him up, and then they said he's going to die in 14 hours, and if people from Missouri need to come, my father's from Missouri, 8 sisters and 1 brother, and his dad, and everybody, we called, and about 5 of them came, and we were at big setup at Fairchilds, because my father was the regional sales manager for Allstate, which was like 100 agents, like a huge diameter around the area here. And so there was just such mobs of people coming, and my mother sat by the casket, and my brother, who had just was unable to go to the hospital to even see my father, had seen him at his worst right after his operation, was basically not able to cope either. So I think he sat most of the time. I can't even visualize where he was in all of this. He was 2 years younger than I was. But I stood at the door and greeted all these people. Now, I had known them, many of them from parties that we had at the house and business parties, and I was able to do that. Well, my aunt came along when I was crying at one point, and my aunt from Missouri, and she said, Marilyn, you cannot cry because your mother will be more sad. So I began the process of crying in the car, which I did, I think, for quite a while. And then I sometimes would cry, even after I got married and had children, I was occasionally crying, and I kept thinking, it's probably because you never sufficiently, and what a thing to tell a 17-year-old. You're not allowed to be sad because someone else might be sadder. And I just was able to do it, and I stood at the door and I did all of that greeting at Fairchild for like two days, I guess it was. And so that was a spot they put me in, and I allowed them to put me in, but I guess I was so young, I just said, all right, I'll be strong. And then it just took years probably for me to face all of that. And as I said, driving around in a car alone, it was sad, alone, like you say, where do you feel safe? I was in the car by myself driving around.
Yeah. So that really hits on what she calls grief shaming. That we should feel ashamed or reticent to grieve in a public setting or even just around other people. That we should kind of keep that to ourselves, or be alone in a car, and that's the only place where we can experience that.
I think grief makes people uncomfortable, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
And that's why you feel like you can't grieve openly, because you're making the people around you uncomfortable and they want you to get over it. You know, like, it's been 6 months or a year, you should be over it by now. When grief is something you carry with you for your life, you know, and it never goes away really.
I find that grief is something that comes with you periodically. And lately, I can't think of who it was, but somebody died. And all of a sudden, that brings me right back to all the other people that I loved that died. So you grieve at different times, but almost continuously through your life, because one brings back the memories of others. And I personally think it's very okay to feel that way.
Yeah.
So if I ever come up to you and say, I'm really sad today, I'll give you a hug and it'll make me feel better.
I mean, not to get too off point, but it's kind of like when you grieve, and she says this, that grief is kind of a way of love continuing after someone dies. And you know, when you say like different points, it'll hit you in different ways. It's like sometimes you encounter experiences where that loved one would have been there, right? And you feel that loss again because they're not. But that grief is very much a way of love persisting and being able to carry on in their absence.
My children have been very blessed that both sets of grandparents are alive. So their first experience of grief was 2 weeks ago when our dog died. She was 16, and you know, we had to bring her in. I could tell that she was fighting, but I said, it's time for us to say thank you to Oreo and let her rest in peace, because she's done a lot for us. But I never thought my boys that are 20 and 21 would be crying like this. And I never said it was wrong, but it took me by surprise that these men that are over a foot taller than me would be bawling. But then again, that's something that has been there the whole time. So my daughter still walks around and she's like, "Where's Oreo?" Like, it feels so weird. So it was my job to respect their grief, but at the same time try to have them be thankful that this dog was with them for so long, and she was great. But it's just the beginning of what they're going to be facing in the future. So.
There's a portion in her book that on page 164, and I like the way she wrote it. She said, "They tried to bury us.
Yes.
They didn't realize we were seeds."
Yeah.
And that tries to bury love, but that is a fool. Love is a seed, grief is its blossom.
Thank you. Yeah, and then she gets on to saying that grief is not the illness that needs to be cured, it's a part of the healing. It's like a scab. Or what does she say? She says a blister, I think. And if you pick at it, it gets worse. And if you let it be, and let it be itself, then you end up healing in the long run.
There are different things that affect grief. If sometimes you have a feeling of shame because you didn't get there to see the person, or you didn't go to see the person or to deal with the person when the person was still alive, and then the person dies, and you have that sense of guilt
And regret.
and regret, and that adds to the grief in a certain way. But then there's the other one of somebody who's been sick for a very long time with no quality of life, and you've been going there and going there and going there and crying when you go out to the car and the person's still alive, and when they die it's such a relief, but you think, well, they're safe from their suffering.
Yeah.
And the grief all took place before the death, not after the death.
Yeah. Yeah, there isn't one journey for grief. It takes many different forms.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we kind of covered this. We talked about grief shaming, but anyone want to push back against that? Anyone feel like it's not totally accurate to say that the church grief shames us?
I will. When I lost my son 2 years ago at 23, this church stood up so much and lifted us up, Francie and I, so much, and continues to do so. And it's a tough thing to lose a son at any time, and it's a tough thing to think about all the things, the comparison thing that could have been, or he would have been doing this, his friends are getting married or whatever, and all that's there. But then we get people, I was at a funeral on Friday, and one of his friends said, you know, when he passed, I really didn't have time to process it. Can we go to lunch with you and your wife? Because I need to talk about it. And that's the stuff that picks you up at times that are there. So if you let the culture grief shame, I guess you can. But on the other hand, you know, like I say, this community of faith is amazing, and so is this community of college, and so are so many other different places where you don't realize how much compassion and help and love is there. And I'm not a very extroverted person, and I'm not very good at receiving love. I'm not a receiver, right? I try. But at times when you need it, it's amazing what resources are there. And so, I'm sure that can happen, but it depends on how you live your life and what you believe and how you approach the whole thing. That can change. The grief doesn't go away. It just has a different shape.
I take care of my close friend who has Parkinson's and has also been battling cancer for 17 years. And recently she had, a very, very, very horrible day. It was including 2 emergency treatments, visits to the dentist, to have tooth pulled. And then they found out a medicine she takes twice a year had hardened all her bones because she had a relapse in her bone once. So that when they were trying to take this out, it was like, why can't we do this? So they sent us to the specialist. And I had to leave her at one point because I had to leave and her husband was on his way. And I find myself, I'm already, even though she has great days and she's in boxing class 3 times a week and we're fighting, she's fighting. I say we because I'm in it with her. But I find myself already starting to grieve. Because when I said invite her to go to where I had to go, I was like, this day couldn't have just happened. I was like, so that, I find myself like, getting choked up a little bit. And I guess I'm on this road to, to the end with Ellen, but it's going to be a long road. She's only 61 years old. So, she's going to
There are cultures that for them to show grief is to cry loudly. And there are cultures, the Chinese tradition is they hire criers so that the family do not have to cry, but there will be a group of people right in front crying for the family. And it just shows to say that it's okay to show those emotions and cry and grieve. And I know that it's just one part of that culture wherein they cannot probably cry anymore, but they wanted to continue it, so they hire people to do it. And they are professional criers, and they get paid well.
I don't envy that job. Okay. So she talks about this idea of scruffy faith and this is the passage where she really defines it. And she says that this is kind of how she sees herself with God, especially when she's feeling grieved. She says, most days I'm plagued with questions I can't answer, anger at God I can't hide, laments I can't let go of, doubts I can't wrestle to the ground, and grief that kicks me in the gut. If faith is a coloring book, I'm definitely the kid who colors outside the lines. And she brings up the story of the Canaanite woman, who's this woman who goes up to Jesus and says, have mercy on me. And Jesus at first says, no, you're a Canaanite, I'm here for the Jews. But she keeps asking, and Jesus eventually gives in and heals her. And she says, I identify with that woman because that woman is coming here and she's got like nothing to lose and she's barely hanging on by a thread. But she's just grabbing on and saying, God, here I am, this is me and I need your help. And that's kind of how she feels in the midst of grief, that we don't necessarily have it all together.
I have a dear friend who lost her husband tragically, and she went through her grief by writing poetry. And the one I really liked was, she said, Peter, Jesus rose from the dead. Couldn't you just give it a try?
Does this resonate with you guys? Is this something that you...
It's what we focus on, though. If we focus on the problem, we can't really see the blessings. I've had very dark days, and working with children is a blessing. I don't like the system, but I love the children. So whenever I might come in, and okay, I leave all my baggage at the door, come in, there's always one or two that brighten your day, so you have to focus on those little blessings that keep you going.
I think we all have scruffy faith. We have very comfortable faith. I question whether that's faith at all. If we're not asking questions and challenged and saying, what am I doing? Am I doing this with the right intention? What direction am I going in? You know, what's happening to me? What's this all about? If you're not questioning all that, it may be very comfortable, but you know, I question the depth of that kind of faith. And I think, you know, forums like this, there's so many places where people can come and discuss issues, and just face issues, regardless of what we do. Like Mary, I have a tough time with this book. It has a lot of approaches to it that come from a direction that I just don't, that doesn't sync with me. On the other hand, the topics that are there are pretty rich, as we're finding out from our discussion and otherwise, and the basic life questions. And like I say, I suspect we all have scruffy faith.
Very much so. So she concludes with this saying that I think is really poignant. She says, every tear we shed over those who died is salty evidence that our love didn't disappear with them in the dirt. And if I were to connect this chapter back to love without limits, it would be that death is not a limit on love. And that it is possible for our love to exceed that. So what do you guys think of this idea that love outwits death?
That love what?
That love outwits death.
Yeah, that's the part I've been looking at, and I don't look at it that way. I don't look at love that way, something that even wants to outwit anything. I think of it as more positive than she does.
Okay.
So you think love wins, is that what you mean? Like love, it doesn't outwit grief, but it wins over death?
I can't put it in a game of winning or losing.
I see what you're saying.
Death is part of life, right?
Yeah, death is part of life.
Maybe what she's
And
trying to
anger.
say is that death removes the person you love from his physical life. But when you love somebody, you outwit death because that person, although they're not physically with you in this life, they're still with you. When you grieve for them, or you think about them, or you remember them, you're still keeping them here. So maybe that's what she means.
I think the context that she is saying that in is for when she's talking about people who are trying to grief shame you.
Yeah.
And I think that it fits when you read that in that whole context. She's saying you can win over those people, or don't let those people get to you. And then that whole thing, that saying makes a lot more sense.
Okay. Yeah. Sweet.
You know, one thing that's interesting about grief is that a person's life stopped. So when you love someone who's alive, they're continuously changing and challenging your love, like by the choices they make or the things they say or do. And you're not loving just one person, but all these different iterations of them over time. And I guess when they die, it's like you almost go backwards. So I think you might remember them at 30, at 20, at 10. But you're loving all the pieces. Maybe today, maybe you're really thinking about them when they're young. But it's a different kind of love than something, because they can't interact with you anymore.
The whole life kind of collapses into one collective set of memories, and that's what you have. I think what's so powerful about this, and I can can see where you're coming from, where you said that it's not about winning, or where life is a part of death, or death is a part of life, or all together. I think what's so powerful about this is realizing that death isn't the end. And if I were to phrase it, I would say that death is not the end of the life that we live with someone, but it radically alters it. It terminates it in many ways, but we still carry that person with us. They're still, in many ways, their memory is an active part of how we live. We reflect on them, we think about them. We still frame our life with reference to them because they impacted us. And to get to what you were saying, Debbie, it's like in the context of the rest of the chapter, what she's kind of saying is that this is the reason why grief can't be something that we run from or try to beat down or are afraid to encounter, because that is itself a part of understanding that and making that traumatic experience, an integral part of our lives.
The feeling I have, and I remember speaking to my shrink about this years after my husband had died, that I felt he was a part of me, a part of who I was, because I had lived with him. And that was satisfying.
I remember after my parents died, sometimes I would get little messages from them, and I could hear them speaking, and I'd write that down. But it's that their essence spoke more loudly than ever, like who they really were and what they were all about was loud and clear, almost even louder and clearer than when they were alive. And just the other thing about animals, how wonderfully powerful they are.
Melba, are we out of time?
One more minute.
One more minute, okay. So we're going to jump to, oops, I did not mean to close this entirely. We're just going to jump to her concluding points that she has at the very end of the book. And I condensed these down a little so they don't take quite so much visual space. But her concluding points for Love Without Limits are, your story matters, tell it. What we need most are people who are not for sale. You can make a difference. You're not powerless. Hope is a map. And finally, that hope wins. And in the last minute that we have left, what do you think it means when she says hope wins in the context of a book about limitless love? Back to the game, yeah. We're back. It's a game for her.
Love is a form of hope.
Love is a form of hope.
To me, hope is also tied into purpose and a direction, and therefore your faith. And without hope, where is the purpose? Where is the intent? Where is the measure?
What are you driving towards? I'll say what I took out of this is there's a lot of messiness in this book. There's a lot of things that don't come together perfectly. A lot of her conclusions don't necessarily come together perfectly. And there's a lot of stories that kind of don't end cleanly. I mean, even her story about grief isn't totally a clean ending. Like, I'm still very much frustrated with that counselor at the beginning of the book who set her on this awful, path where she felt like she couldn't encounter grief. I think when she says hope wins, why that's so important to this book, is because we have to have the faith to believe that our love can be boundless, the way that God's love is. But to do that, we really have to have hope, because we're not going to see it come together necessarily in our lives. We're not going to see it land perfectly. She doesn't say that love is perfect. She doesn't say that love is complete the way we live it. But she does say that we need to strive for it, to not have the limits that we commonly impose on it. And I think that's what's really the takeaway from her book. Hope is what makes us complete. Hope is what lets us look towards something that we can't envision now. And hope is what gives us that purpose. We say, what are we really driving towards? And in the season of Lent, where we're fasting and we're praying and we're looking towards God for our guidance, to remember the hope that comes to us in Easter is what brings this all together. We have an ending on Good Friday that seems so imperfect and so abrupt, and God turns it into an Easter Sunday. And there's one quote that she has here that I absolutely love. If I can find it. It's not in my notes, I apologize. It is essentially we need what does she say? We need the Easter time disruption of our lives. We need that Easter joy to force us to encounter a love that is beyond limits. And that is where our hope